points that I want to bring to Norman Podhoretz. But number one, this question of deterrence. If these other countries, Mr. Zakaria is listing, have listened to the argument to use nuclear weapons, they would be destroying themselves. Why do you think that argument doesn't work with Iran?
Well, I'll tell you why. First, I want to say that I think the attitude expressed by Fareed Zakaria represents an irresponsible complacency that I think is comparable to the denial in the early 30s of the intentions of Hitler that led to what Churchill called an unnecessary war involving millions and millions of deaths that might have been averted if the West had acted early enough.
And Norman, perhaps instead of calling me names, you could just explain why the arguments are right or wrong. That would be just fine.
Why can't...
Let's let Mr. Podhoretz finish his point.
Yeah, I would appreciate being allowed to finish my point. The reason deterrence can't work with Iran is that there's a different element involved here than was involved with either Mao or even Kim Jong-il or Stalin, and that is the element of religious fanaticism. The fact of the matter is that with a religious fanatic like Ahmadinejad and the malocracy ruling Iran generally, there's no assurance that self-preservation or the preservation of the nation will deter them. And let me tell you why. Here is what the Ayatollah Khomeini, of whom Ahmadinejad is a devoted disciple, once said. He said, "We do not worship Iran, we worship Allah. For patriotism is another name for paganism. I say, let this land of Iran burn. I say, let this land go up in smoke, provided Islam emerges triumphant in the rest of the world." Well, you can't deter a nation that is led by people with that kind of attitude. And what's more, on the issue of whether these are revolutionaries, let me again quote Ahmadinejad himself.
Well,
thanks to the... May I?
If you don't mind, I'd like to go back to Mr. Zakaria on that point, because essentially what you're arguing, Mr. Podhoretz, is that the Iranian leadership's not rational. Mr. Zakaria?
Well, they're rational within their own frame of reference, but not within ours.
All right, Mr. Zakaria.
You know, I had a feeling Norman would bring up that Warren quotation that he's used before, so I have one from now. If the worst came to worst and half of mankind died, the other half would remain, while imperialism would be razed from the ground. This is what Mao said, and it wasn't just his words, it was his actions. He was actively aiding revolutionary movements and killing Americans all over the world. So the question about Iran's rationality rests on this. They've been in power for 30 years. What have they done? Iran has followed a pretty rational, national interest-oriented foreign policy. If you look at the way in which they opposed Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, this was another Islamic revolutionary movement. You'd think that they would find them sympathetic, but no, they were the sworn enemies of Al-Qaeda, and they helped the United States depose the Taliban.
All right,
the Iranians have, by and large, over the last 30 years, been fairly calculating. They have followed their national interest. When it has bumped up against the United States, they have worked against us. When they have thought that our interests were in common, as in Afghanistan, they've worked with us.
And Mr. Podhoretz, on that point?
Yeah, let me respond to that. You know, similar arguments were made about Hitler in the early 30s, and it appalls me that this kind of attitude can still prevail after what we should have learned from the words of despots. Let me quote Ahmadinejad. "Thanks to the blood of the martyrs, a new Islamic revolution has arisen. The era of oppression, hegemonic regimes, and tyranny and injustice has reached its end. The wave of the Islamic revolution will soon reach the entire world, and that is a world," he says, "without America and without Israel." And he says, people who say, "How is this possible?" says this goal is attainable and surely can be achieved. He goes on to say, nobody believed we could topple the Shah or the Soviets, but we did both, and we can create a world without Israel, wiping Israel off the map, and diminishing American influence to the point where it will no longer stand in our way.
Mr. Zakaria, what about that?
Look, if you look at the way in which the mullahs have run Iran, by and large, they have been incredibly savvy. They're building up bank accounts in Dubai and in Switzerland. This does not strike me as the kind of ravings of an end-of-days millenarian. The Iranians are trying to capture the core political high ground of the Middle East, and they are trying to become the dominant power in the region. We should be working against them. We should be building an alliance against them. But the idea that they are not going to be deterred by Israel's 200 nuclear weapons, including a second strike capacity on submarines, is just fantasy. It's based on plucking a few quotes here and there from a president who is not constitutionally or operationally in charge of the nuclear program. When the Iranians elected a moderate, a man called Khatami, as the president, conservatives kept telling us the president has no powers. Now they elect Ahmadinejad and they say he's got his finger on the bomb.
Gentlemen, we would love to have this go on for an hour. Unfortunately, we have only a minute or less left. So I have one final question I do want to ask you both because I think it's important. Mr. Podhoretz, do you think that, as you wrote a few months ago, this administration, this president intends, before he leaves office, to strike Iran?
Yes, I do believe he will, because he has said many times, or at least 2 times that I know of in public, that if we allow Iran to get the bomb, people 50 years from now will look back at us the way we look back at the men who made the Munich Pact with Hitler in 1938 and say, how could they have let this happen? Well, unlike Fareed Zakaria and the foreign policy establishment that is complacent and irresponsible, in my opinion, I think the president recognizes the danger. I think he knows that the time is short, the time is not on our side, and I think he will take military action, not an invasion, but airstrikes before he leaves office.
And Fareed Zakaria, if you would, a brief response.
Oh, I would doubt it. Look, in the early 1980s, Norman Podhoretz and neoconservatives believed the Soviet Union was going to take over the world and Finlandize Europe. When Reagan started talking to the Soviets, started talking to Gorbachev, Mr. Podhoretz excoriated him, called it the Reagan road to détente and such. It turned out he was wrong. It turned out that the Soviets were not that powerful and that history was on our side and that things were going to work out as long as we kept our cool. I believe in just the way that we have deterred the Soviet Union, Mao's China, Kim Jong-il, history will prove that we can use deterrence and containment to contain the problem of Iran, and that we do not need to launch a third unilateral invasion just to do that.
Fareed Zakaria,
God help us if we follow that,
Norman,
that counsel.
Norman Podhoretz, we thank you. Fareed Zakaria. Gentlemen, we thank you both very much.